Thank you. It's hard to believe, but I'm the youngest of three in my family. And when my older brother and sister learned how to type, I did not want to be the only one in the family who did not know how to type. So I stole my sister's book on how to teach yourself to type, and I taught myself how to manually type. This was back in the days of a manual or sometimes an electric typewriter. And once I learned how to touch type, I had nothing to type. So I started making up stories, really as just a way to put words on paper. And one thing led to another, and before I was 15, I had probably written 100 short stories. But really as just a means to learn how to type. And I went through high school in America and college, and tried to be a musician for a number of years, and through a long process, eventually ended up a writer. But it was really not intentional. I don't think I ever knew I was going to be a writer. And I got lucky, which is what it takes in writing. After 8.5 years of trying to get published, I was finally published. And a few books into that, my fourth book became a big bestseller. And I was off and running, and I ended up in a rock and roll band with Stephen King and Amy Tan, and among others, Dave Barry. Do you all know what a hot dog is? It's a sausage of sorts we eat in America. This is Dave Barry in front of the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile. He's a very silly guy, very funny guy, and he has won a Pulitzer Prize for writing humor columns that are published, at one time were published in over 500 publications around the world each week. Dave and I are in this band. This is Amy Tan wearing a wig, and Stephen King. People ask me what Amy plays in the band, and I say spandex and lycra. And Stephen King is this goofy, best-selling author, probably the biggest-selling author in the world. And to give you an idea of how good this band is, we have an expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if you look at the woman in front, you'll see how good our band is. That sums up our talent. That's Dave and me up on stage there. Dave and I ended up working together to write a book that was a prequel to Peter Pan. My then 5-year-old daughter had asked me how Peter met Captain Hook. And I didn't have an answer. I also didn't know, why can Peter fly? Why does Peter never grow old? Where did Tinkerbell come from? There were all these questions that I thought might work as a book about a young boy who becomes Peter Pan. And Dave and I wrote a book called Peter and the Starcatchers. We had a ton of fun. We thought we would write a 90-page book and maybe sell 8 copies of it. But Disney got a hold of it. And it turned out, just to get to the creation of Tinkerbell, we had written a 600-page book, not 90 at all. We finished it, Disney published it, and it became an international bestseller that stayed on the New York Times list for 47 weeks. And Disney, of course, being a business, came to us and said, is there another book you could write? And I said, well, we could write one about the shadows, because in the classic, Peter shows up to find his shadow that he has left behind. It's never really explained how he can detach from his shadow, or why he would want to have detached from his shadow. So I said to Dave Barry, my co-writer, maybe we could write a book about Peter and the shadows. And he said, yeah, and that would be like 10 words long. 650 pages later, we had Peter and the Shadow Thieves. And then there were enough questions unanswered at the end of Shadow Thieves that we decided we would write one final book and make it a trilogy. And we would call that Peter and the Secret of Rundoon. Rundoon is this mythical sort of Middle Eastern kingdom that the kids are headed to in Peter and the Starcatchers. One of the really fun aspects about writing for younger audiences is that your books are illustrated, and certainly your covers are illustrated. And Dave and I and Disney have worked with this amazing illustrator named Greg Call. Dave and I write in a very funny way. We outline the books together so that we know everything that's going to happen in them. And then we write them by character. I take the villainous characters, and if chapter 3 is mostly the villains, I write the first draft of it, and I send it to Dave. And he can do anything he likes to it. He can leave it as it is. He can rewrite the whole chapter. He can rewrite just a few pieces of it. And he sends it back to me. And if he's cut a bunch of my pages out, as he often does, then I stuff them back in. Hopefully without him knowing. But he always catches it, cuts them out again, and we go back and forth 6, 8, 10 times. Chapter 57 of Peter and the Starcatchers was rewritten 11 times. And when the chapter is completed, we look at the next in the outline. And if it's mostly the kids, then Dave tries the first draft of it and sends it to me. And back we go. Well, we do the same procedure with the illustrator, Greg Call, who reads the book and talks to us about what sort of the most exciting chapter is in the book and what he might try as an illustration. And then we edit his work. So for Peter and the Secret of Rundoon, the third book, this was the first illustration we got. That's Peter. And behind him is a girl named Molly, and that's a flying camel. And all I can say is never stand under a flying camel after it's eaten, which is what happens in the book. We explain in this book where flying carpets come from. And one of our comments to Greg Call initially was, we love this look, but Peter is flying, which Peter Pan can do. Peter is flying off the carpet. And we really want to imply that the carpet has the magic, not Peter. So could you put Peter back on the carpet? And also, King Zarboff, who's in these books, is not really represented terribly well in this. Could we put Zarboff in the cover as well? And this is what Greg came back with. Now we had King Zarboff very big, and Peter was up on the carpet. The trouble was, we felt now the emphasis was too much on Zarboff. That although he's an important character, it almost took it away from Peter. And we asked Greg if he could tone it back a bit. And this is what he came up with. And now we felt we were getting somewhere. Zarboff is dead center under the camel. He needs an umbrella, by the way. And Molly's still in it. Peter's on the magic carpet. And Greg thought to get the snake on it. The snake is a huge boy-eating snake that Zarboff turns these little boys over to when he tires of them, and the snake eats them. So it's not really a good scene for the young kids. Greg said, I'm glad you like this. I think you'll like it more when I bring it to color. And this is what he sent us. And it really started to come to life for us. And now he said, the final bit is going to put the text on it. And this was the final of the book cover. So Dave and I, as we always do, headed out on the book tour in the United States, city to city to city, to promote the book and talk about the books. And we read at these. We take out a section of the book and we read it so that the kids can hear the book come alive. We went to Miami, Florida. And in Miami, Florida, which is where Dave lives, we had a very big crowd in attendance. And the person who ran the bookstore had a surprise for us that he didn't tell us about. In the book, we have this massive snake. It turns out, only in Miami, you can rent a snake. So the owner of the bookstore rented a 90-pound, 11-foot Burmese python. And while we were reading, the person who owned the snake came up and put it onto us. There's the python. Now, it's this fat around, and it runs all the way off, like over to that stand from what you see. Pythons are constrictors. I don't particularly like snakes. This python comes up over my shoulder, goes around my neck like a muffler, and ends up with his head right next to my left ear. You know in Harry Potter where there's Parseltongue? You know, which I always thought was just a joke. I mean, you know, you can talk to snakes. This snake parks himself right here, and he goes Dave is reading and he starts to shake and he says, "Is that you? Is that you? Is that you?" And I said, "It's the snake. It's the snake." This snake was whispering in my ear and terrifying me. We've had a ton of fun with Peter and the Starcatchers. We've answered the question of how a boy becomes Peter Pan. And Disney, which is just an amazing company to work for, had the wisdom to treat the first book, Peter and the Starcatchers, as a stage play. They hired a man named Rick Ellis, who wrote a play called Jersey Boys, to adapt our book as a stage play, and it opened off-Broadway last spring and did phenomenally well. And Disney has now decided to release it on Broadway this February, and they also have plans to make a major motion picture out of the first book. So we've become very excited. Dave Barry is one of these know-it-all kind of guys, and it's frustrating because he really does know it all. So he's difficult to work with because he's way too smart. When Marcel and I wanted to take our kids to Disney World, I mentioned to Dave that we were going to Disney World, and he said, "Not without me, you aren't." So the two families went together. And when we came out of Disney World the first night, my little writer's mind looked back into the park and realized there were 60 or 80,000 people leaving the Magic Kingdom in Disney World, and nowhere to be seen were Mickey, Minnie, Goofy, Buzz Lightyear, all the characters that we'd seen in the park. They were all staying behind. And I just had this moment where I thought, what are all the characters doing in the park for the next 12 hours while we're sleeping? And I started thinking, what if they're alive, they have their own world once the people get out, and they are in constant battle with the good characters of Disney World, trying to regain or take power over the good characters. And what would happen, since every kid's dream is to break into Disney World after dark, what would happen if 5 kids ended up in the middle of this pitched battle? And that series became The Kingdom Keepers. The way a person writes is we observe the world around us, and I happen to take a lot of notes about it. Then we report on it. We write our first draft, second draft, third draft, and then we edit what we've written, and if we're lucky enough, that gets published. So as I was debating writing this series about 5 kids who get inside Disney World after dark, I talked to Disney and asked them if I could gain access to their theme parks to do research. And they said, "Well, what exactly do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to go in when the park is closed." And they said, "Oh, I don't think that'll happen." And I said, "Okay, well then I don't really think I could do the book justice, and I guess I just shouldn't write this book." And they called back about a month later and said, "Okay, you have your own VIP pass to the parks, and whenever you want to go in after hours, we will arrange it for you." So I was able to use my powers of observation to do my research. And I'm going to test your powers of observation right now. So especially the younger audience, I want you to look at the screens and tell me what animal you see. Anybody know what that is? What did I hear? A frog. But are you sure? It certainly looks like a frog. But it's also a horse. There's the frog. And there's the horse. What I do in my children's fiction is I try to see the world we all see and then twist it, just like that, so that the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Dave and I do that in Peter and the Starcatchers, and I try to do that in the Kingdom Keepers. I go in at 5 in the morning, and I go on to the rides and the attractions when they're shut down. I study them. Disney turns them on for me. I ride them, and then I stick around and watch the public ride them. This is Cinderella's Magic Castle in the Magic Kingdom. And one of the problems of writing The Kingdom Keepers is Disney is a very thoughtful company, and they said, you know, you can't harm kids in your stories. You can't have our rides be sabotaged. You can't have somebody come into the parks with a knife or a gun, but we want them really suspenseful. And I said, So I thought and thought and thought, how could I get around that? And then I happened to be at a seminar, and the teacher up at the front of the room had on his desk a dish that created a hologram out of just natural light. It didn't plug in or anything. And the hologram looked absolutely solid. And I thought, there's my story. What if the 5 kids are holograms? Then anything can happen to them. They can get stabbed by swords. They can get kidnapped because they're really just a projection of light. They aren't kids. And I ran that by Disney, and they said, there's your answer. That's the way to go with your story. So in the story, there are 5 teenage guides who are hired by Disney to model, kind of like on a green screen for a movie, to be holograms inside the park. The only thing they didn't figure on is when the real kids go to sleep at night, they wake up as their own holograms inside the park and find themselves in a pitched battle with the Disney villains. And that is The Kingdom Keepers. So in I go the first time, 5 in the morning, and they let me into a ride called Small World, which, if you've been to Disney Hong Kong, you know is all these dolls from all over the world singing this obnoxious song over and over. And I got to go in when it was dark. These are the cute little dolls. But this is what it looks like when it's dark. It was creepy in there. I was all alone, except for my guide in this boat. And we're going along scene by scene. There's no music. There's no colorful lights. All the dolls are stopped and frozen. And 2 of the dolls moved. And I jumped about 6 feet out of the boat and said, yeah! The Imagineer sitting next to me said, what's wrong with you? And I said, and he said, what's wrong? I said, 2 of the dolls just moved. And he said, Ridley, the ride is shut down. There is no way the dolls moved. But I wrote in my little notebook, 2 of the dolls moved. And when I wrote the chapter about the 5 teenagers being backstage in Disney World at 2 in the morning and on Small World, I had not 2, not 10, but all the dolls come alive and attack the kids. They march like Chucky and dive into the water and swim and snap at the kids. And when I submitted this to Disney, I was sure they would take it out of the book. And, I thought they would censor me. And they left it in. So really everything I've written about, Disney has never censored out. I've been on Splash Mountain. And in the middle of Splash Mountain is this amazing scene. You're in these log boats. You end up going down this big flute. And I've worked that into the book. I've also been to the Animal Kingdom. This is the Tree of Life in the Animal Kingdom. And on to Expedition Everest, which is a giant roller coaster. I don't know if you can see how small a person is next to that fence. But Disney spent $100 million building this attraction. It's a giant roller coaster, and they let me go inside when the lights were on and the ride was turned off. I walked the entire ride, and then they turned it on and said, now it's your turn to ride this ride. And I said, I don't do roller coasters. And the person said, I flew in here to show you my roller coaster, and you are getting on my roller coaster. So I got on, and you go screaming along, and I'm reminding you, I hate roller coasters, and this is what you see. End of the track. It skids to a stop, then it goes backwards through the dark at 45 miles an hour, at which point I was ready to lose my lunch. I walked around the park the rest of the day like this. I was a pathetic wreck. But I worked it into the story, including this giant beast that's in the ride. I also got to go into the bat enclosure. This is a fruit bat about this big. At one point in the novel, one of the 5 kids, Charlene, has to climb the rock wall you see behind there with all the bats. And in case you think they're all cute and cuddly, this is a close-up. That's one of the bats. Gives me the creeps. The 3rd book in the Kingdom Keepers series was written about Epcot, where there's a terrific ride called Soarin', where you feel like you're in a hand glider flying over all sorts of parts of California. When they let me into the Soarin' ride, I go up to the projection room, which is a super IMAX, and I found an old journal in there that detailed all the malfunctions the ride has had over the years. And I worked all of those into the book. I also got to go on a ride called Test Track. The unique thing for me about Test Track was that in the waiting line where you queue up and take all this time, there are crash test dummies. And here they brought one of the cars out for me when I was doing a TV show. And they had a crash test dummy. In my novel, the crash test dummies come alive and attack the kids, as do the trolls in Norway. This is about a 6-foot troll in Norway. So piece by piece, I would work through my novels, whatever aspect I could find in my research, and then bring it to life. I try to put reality into fiction. The reason I do that is a novelist's job is to suspend the reader's disbelief. To suspend the reader's disbelief. If you start not believing what I'm writing about, you'll throw my book across the room. I have to suspend that disbelief. So I feel that if I put a lot of fact into my fiction, you're likely to believe it because it is in fact believable. It's fact. It's not fiction. Inside Epcot, I had asked the Imagineers, the people that run the parks, what the spookiest ride in all of Epcot is. And they said, oh, well, that would have to be the Wonders of Life because it's been closed for 5 years. They keep it lit, they keep it cleaned, but it's a giant pavilion that's capable of holding 5,000 to 10,000 people, and it's absolutely empty. And up on the second floor is this carnival theme. I've never been a big fan of clowns or sort of the carnival theme, and they have an entire deck themed that way, including a conference room that plays a big part in the book. This is my editor sitting in a chair, that the entire inside makes you feel like you're inside a carousel. Another series I've written, again based on research, is called Steel Trap. This is my first book in my children's series to have a Chinese publisher. It's going to be translated into traditional Chinese in the next 6 months. It is based in large part on a school that I attended, a boarding school. This is the chapel of that school. And it plays a big role because it leads down into these tunnels. It's really quite a beautiful school and a beautiful chapel. All of these are scenes that are in the book. This is the chapel when it's got people in it. And way down at the end on the right is the organs pipe room, where all the pipes for the organs are. And there is a secret door there that lets you into that. And below that, there are tunnels that connect throughout the school. And so in Steel Trap, the academy, my protagonist, a young 14-year-old with a photographic memory, finds out about these tunnels and is able to go like a gopher all through the school without ever being caught. There's a game called Gaga in the book. Gaga is a real game, although few people have heard of it. My last book, my most recent book, the one I'm working on right now in the Kingdom Keepers series, is to take place on the Disney Cruise Line. And yes, once again, in all their wisdom, Disney has given me 4 free cruises on their cruise line so that I could write about the Disney Cruise Line, the most recent on the Disney Dream. It's been this amazing experience because they've let me into the engine room, they've let me backstage in all the kitchens, they've let me into the crew quarters, up onto the deck with the captain, into the pilot house. It's just been, the access has been phenomenal, and I've had such an amazing experience writing this book that my one book has now turned into 2, so it's going to be the 5th and 6th book in the series, of which there's 7 total. So that's my dog and pony show. That's how I write and what I do, and I think now Chip may come up and we may talk some more about writing and take your questions. Please welcome Chip Zhao.
Thank you for your entertaining lecture, right? I'm sure, Mr. Pearson, as someone from America, you have the combined talents of both an English writer and some American orators, speakers like Billy Graham, Bob Hope, or even Barack Obama, right? Whether you like it or not. Right? This is the difference, I would say, between an average British writer and an American writer. English writers are a little bit shy, a bit of an introvert, or you call that subtlety. But American writers, I don't know whether it's because of your training, or you live in a TV or show business cultural environment, you tend to be more outspoken, more brave, and
more foolish.
Wow, I'm not sure, Right, and then if all the Hong Kong school teachers, English school teachers, be it natives or Chinese, possess about 1/3 of your speech talent, I think
Thank you,
our Hong Kong school children would have fared much better in the English. Right? Well, you mentioned Disney. Well, that's very interesting. Now, Disney is a very tough institution to deal with. They're arrogant, patronizing.
You think?
I think so. Right? Well, this is under my impression. I've been reading perhaps too many liberal stuffs, Noam Chomsky, or
I've had nothing but fun with Disney. Rarely do you see a company where everyone in it is a child at heart. Of the thousands of people in the parks that work for Disney, there's 10 or 20,000 that work in Orlando for Disney. And I meet them at my book signings, and they're all just so excited and happy. And if you think about it, it's one of those rare entertainment companies that is so focused on giving families a good time that I think they weed out the people who are sort of petulant and troublemakers, and you end up with people that are genuinely happy to be working there.
It's not just Disney. It's also, I get the same perception. I got the same impression of Las Vegas.
Oh, yes.
Julius
I wouldn't
Caesar.
put the two in the
Now, Julius
same
Caesar,
sentence.
right? I mean, it might be a little bit inappropriate to compare the two. But you get into Disneyland with a ticket, you get there at 9 o'clock, and then you forget the clock, right?
Yeah.
And then you are led into a never-ending land of fun.
Yeah,
right?
it is. It's a magical
From the
world.
cyclone right, to something else,
Yes.
magical world of timeless fun, right? You tend to forget you tend to forget a sense of time.
That's what I
and
try to do with my
space.
writing exactly.
Exactly. Right, so your writings, I mean, I've been reading some. I've been struggling to read some because, I have been a little bit annoyed that, there aren't many publications of Mr. Pearson's books in the public. But I hope from now on, after this book fair, bookshops like Dymox will be flooded with Starcatcher.
I hope so too.
Right. You draw your readers into a mythical, a magical, but a little bit dark world.
Yes.
Children like darkness. Look at Harry Potter.
Oh, yes.
The world of witchcraft, right?
Yes.
The Hogwarts, the school, right?
Yes.
The witchcraft school. Many strange stories happen at night.
Yes.
For Western children, you are, from your childhood, you are obsessed or fascinated by fairy tales, witchcrafts,
Yes.
right? Monsters, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And,
I always thought there was a monster
horror.
under my
You're
bed.
drawn into the world of horror, contrary to your parents, to the parents or teachers' expectation. Although at school, you're more or less forced or told to read Bibles. You're told how bright the heaven is going to be like, right? Broad daylight, right? But at night. Now, do you think children, like all men, have a tendency, have an inborn inclination towards what people may call evil, represented by the night, darkness, owls, right, witchcrafts, and monsters, castles under the moonlight, werewolves, and that sort of things?
I think it all intrigues us because it's not of our world. But because fiction is about contrast and about conflict, then in our normal everyday world, which hopefully is bright and happy, in order to have conflict, we bring in the darkness for something to rub against our normal world. and to be an extraordinary world.
Well, that's the thing I like to talk about, because in Chinese cultural world, we have been indoctrinated with Confucius teachings, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with Confucius, but Confucius teachings have been telling our school children to turn away from all the bad things, right? To turn away from the night and just look at the broad daylight of virtues and righteousness and all goodness.
I think this is why I like China so much.
Right. Do you think this is what you like,
well,
spending your time in Shanghai?
Yeah, we spent that year in Shanghai, and it's so refreshing to be somewhere where everyone, and really everyone, seems genuinely happy. And it's not a Disney kind of happy. No. It's a genuine happiness.
Well, it's a kind of happiness of with a Leninist style, perhaps.
You think? Yeah, I don't know. It felt so natural to me, and it was so refreshing compared to some of the sort of meaner streets of America.
Now, the world,
we loved it.
The social reality in Shanghai, do you find it very different from where you grew up?
Well,
in the Mississippi,
I think that
California, or anywhere in America?
What China has retained that America has lost, and I hope China doesn't lose this, is the focus on family. And I mean, we would see this, of course, in your holidays, in the fall, and again at Chinese New Year's, how important it is to reconnect with your family, and how, I mean, just in our lane, everyone, there would be the mom and the dad and the grandparents and the kids kids, all living either in the same building or right next to each other, and it to me is so refreshing, because in America, you get to a certain age, 17, 18, and you go away from home. And you hardly ever see your parents after that.
Well, I'm not sure whether, from my view, the grass is always greener next door,
that's right? That's right.
But the American children are encouraged to be independent.
Yes.
Right, okay, but the family sense is still there. The family bondage is still there.
It is there,
Thanksgiving Day.
If you don't practice it.
Christmas Day.
That's right.
Christmas Eve. Right?
But it's 1 or 2 days a year instead of a part of your heart.
Well, but we Chinese are more or less a little bit too subconsciously haunted with the idea of parents. So we are more or less, particularly, what's the term, right? We are more or less psychologically bullied by the father, right?
By the father.
Yeah, so we need from time to time the Chairman Mao, right? Someone like Chairman Mao. But strangely, paradoxically, you call someone like George Washington and Franklin and Jefferson, you're the founding fathers of America.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Yes. But those fathers are not that possessive. Those fathers don't control your thinking. Those fathers say, okay, we give you freedom. We grant you freedom and independence of mind.
Yes.
Dear children, go fight for your future, and at the same time, keep the freedom that you have been granted.
Yes,
whereas in our family sense, father, dear father, and the dear father and freedom don't necessarily go together.
Well, yes. I don't know. I mean,
So when you spend some time in Shanghai,
I had a rather strong father as well. So.
Right. Tell me, how is your Shanghai experience going to shed light on your next work? Right?
Well, I think our year in Shanghai has changed me forever. But in terms of my practical work, I also write adult crime novels, and my next crime novel is set in Shanghai.
Yeah, set in Shanghai?
Yes.
So that sounds a little bit sinister.
It is a little sinister, yes.
Right?
There's kidnapping and corruption and all sorts of things.
So has Disney expressed some interest in turning that synopsis into another movie?
Disney has not. We do have some interest in a movie, but we'll see. There's some concern that from the movie people that it paints China in a bit of a harsh light, and they may not want to deal with that. Right. So we'll see.
Well, as long as the movie is not shown in public in China, you're okay. Right? Because like James Bond, there is always an enemy of political convenience. It used to be the Soviet Union, and in recent years it's been North Korea.
Yeah,
and
or
the
Afghanistan,
Taliban, Afghanistan, right. And now I'm dying to see a red star, a red star somewhere, symbolizing an evil palace, to be smashed.
It won't be from me because I like China.
Right? To be smashed by Her Majesty's service, right? A spy from Her Majesty's service, right? Well, I mean, coming back to your novel, right? You have a very strong technique, a very powerful technique of storytelling. Right? Your books are all what people call page turner.
Yes, well,
turn
thank
on
you.
the first page,
I appreciate that.
First paragraph, even the first line. You are drawn into.
I want to grab the reader.
Claustrophobic world of childhood or thriller, fear and suspense, right?
Yes.
So, have you ever learned any writing in school? Or some people suggest go to do an MFA at Iowa, University of Iowa, attend a workshop or whatever. Do you think the writing skill is something inborn or your instinct?
I mean, I think if
been acquired.
Yes,
right?
I think if you're a writer. I think better writing can be taught, but I don't think you can be taught to be a writer. I talked to my co-writer Dave Barry a lot about this because I knew when I was 12 years old or 13 years old and in 7th grade, I would try to, matchmake, where you try to take a boy and make her like a certain, take a boy and make him like a girl, or take a girl and make him like a boy. I would make up stories in order to matchmake my friends. I was just storytelling. And I would say, he really likes you, even though he hadn't said anything to me. And I think when you're a storyteller. And if you know you are a storyteller, you will devote yourself to storytelling. I worked as a bartender and a cleaner and a mover and a musician and any number of other jobs for 8.5 years without getting paid to write, because I love to write. And at some point, someone finally bought something I'd written. But I think even now, if I was in, say, a teaching position, or if I was in the corporate world, I would still be getting up in the morning and writing because it's in me. Being a storyteller is part of me. If you like to do that, then I think MFA programs and journalism programs and all of that can improve your skills, because you never get, at least I never get to the level I want to get as a writer. But I don't think you can take person A and say, you're going to be a writer, and put them through a school program and then they're going to be a writer. I think you sort of know if you're a writer or not.
How did the job of bartending contribute to your writing career? Did you
It kept me alive.
On people's conversation? Right?
I do. I am an eavesdropper. Right. It is interesting. My wife will tell you I'm terrible company at dinner in a restaurant, because I'm listening to the conversation at the next table rather than her. And she's going, have you heard anything I've said? Did you hear what's going on over there? I sat in a New York bar waiting for my editor one time. And there were these two men talking very close to me. And one of them was describing this woman in a way that just got more and more and more eye-opening and intense. I was salivating. And I took my notebook out and I was writing all these things. People talk to each other about this stuff. And it just got more and more sort of dirty and over the top. And then there was a pause, and he said, and she was the greatest schnauzer I ever had. The man had been talking about a dog. I thought he'd been talking about a woman. And it just went to show me how dirty my mind was, because he was being totally clean. But yes, I am terrible in that I eavesdrop and eavesdrop and eavesdrop, because that, after all, is how you get to learn more about character. And character is what makes, I hope, good fiction. Do you think we should take some questions from the audience?
Yes, it sounds like some scenes, the notorious opening scene.
Yes.
Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction.
Exactly.
Right? It exactly happened at a cafe.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The next table, two men are talking, and suddenly gunshot.
Yeah, exactly.
A massacre.
Yeah.
Right? out of a blue.
And the great cafe
Shock.
scene in Inglourious Bastards.
Oh,
That's
my
an
God,
amazing scene.
I think Quentin Tarantino, I think
He's
he's a little
something
bit mad.
else. Yeah, he is
half
mad.
crazy.
Does anyone have a question
Any
that
question?
I can answer?
Yes?
Yes, in the back.
The gentleman there, the young gentleman there, please.
I am not an expert at your books myself, but could you go in depth into what sort of books you write, or say the Kingdom Keepers, for instance? What's the story behind that?
What are the stories? Well, the central story behind the Kingdom Keepers is that they're 5 teenagers who end up in between this war between mythical good characters and mythical bad characters, villains in Disney World. So the arch villain in the stories is a witch called Maleficent, who's actually a fairy in Disney lore. And in Peter and the Starcatchers, because it's a prequel to Peter Pan, it's really Captain Hook, and there's this shadow lord called Umbra, which is Italian for shadow, that ends up the arch villains in those stories against Peter and this young girl. And the story is really more about Molly, this young girl in the late 1800s, and the strength she possesses. And she sort of pulls Peter along. Disney had done an animated version of Peter Pan back in 1953. And it turned Wendy, who is in Peter Pan, the great classic, into this sort of, oh, Peter, oh, this, help me, Peter, help me, this. And Dave Barry and I both have daughters. I don't have a son. I have daughters, and my daughters are strong little girls. And when we went to write this series, we said, we are not going to put Molly into these books and have her, oh, Peter, help me, help me. So we end up having Peter saying, Molly, help me, because that to us is more real in life.
They're very fussy with things like intellectual properties, right?
So I think you mentioned earlier that you did research and then you transferred that into your fantasy fiction. Can you give an example of how you do that? And what is the fine line between, how do you transform, and what is the fine line between reality and fiction?
Yes. Because I want these to feel real to you, like in the Kingdom Keepers. When I went and went on that ride at 5 in the morning, and I really did see 2 dolls move. I swear to that. I took a note about it, and then I have the kids see dolls move. And so that's reality infusing itself into my fiction. When I went and visited Splash Mountain and it was shut down, the gentleman who showed me around the ride had been the man behind that ride for over 25 years. He had run Splash Mountain. And he was this old white-haired gentleman, very dignified guy, knew everything there was to know about Disney World. And I had already written about half the book. And I had in my book a character named Fred, who was a white-haired old guy who knew everything there was to know about Disney World. And here I was, touring the facility before it opened, and I met Fred. And so I said to this gentleman, I have a character in my book who really is you. Could I make him you instead of Fred? And he said, oh, I'd be honored to be in your books, and his name is Wayne. And so Wayne is the mentor in the Kingdom Keepers. The fun thing about that is that kids can go into the park, and they can go to get on Splash Mountain, and if they look real carefully, the white-haired gentleman is wearing a tag that says Wayne. And they will say, are you Wayne from the Kingdom Keepers? And he says, I sure am. And they have him sign their maps and do all this stuff. So it's bringing reality into my fiction and fiction into reality in a way. In fact, the cast members who now come and get my autograph and my signings inside Disney World tell me that when the rides break down now, they say, the Overtakers are at work, which is right out of my book. So I have put nonfiction, the facts into my book, and they've taken my fiction and put it into the parks. So it's kind of an exchange.
I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
Firstly, about co-writing.
Right.
I'm interested to know a little bit more why you decided to co-write and what are the pros and cons about that. And
Yes.
if you don't mind, one other quick question. I see that the title of this event is Young Adult Fiction. By the characters and settings and things, this sounds rather sort of mid-grade to me, rather than young adult. Is that
Yes,
right?
it probably is. If I think technically now YA probably skews older, like Twilight and that kind of thing. And this is, although this is read by 70-year-olds, they do aim it more at middle grades. I think their target, the way publishers work, their target grades are probably middle school. But it's really fun when you do write a series, because the first Kingdom Keepers was now written 7 or 8 years ago. So a strong core audience for my books are now college students who write me all the time and say, I first read your book when I was 14. I'm 22 now. I'm graduating from college. I still read them. I love them. They come to my signings all over the country. Their parents read them to them when they were littler, and so now the parents are reading the books. And it's really fun because you gain a very large group of readers from 10 or 11 all the way through their 50s, 60s, 70s. Writing with another person is a very tricky ordeal. And it's hard enough to write a book alone. And I think that if Dave Barry and I had given it any thought, we never would have tried to co-write something, because it is hard enough to do alone. But at that time, I was primarily kind of a psychological adult thriller writer. I wrote very dark crime novels. And that's what I knew how to write. And Dave and I were friends in this band, and I knew Dave to be a very childlike person. He's a very silly guy. And his really, where he's made all his money is writing about, nose boogers. That silly a thing. And so I was at breakfast with him, and I was saying, my daughter asked me about how Peter Pan met Captain Hook, and I'm really considering writing a prequel to Peter Pan. And when his eyes kind of went wide, I thought, here's a guy who's very childlike and very funny. And I tend to be a little more serious and complicated. My books tend to be quite dense. And I wasn't sure I could write at a level that younger audiences would enjoy. And I said flat out to him, I said, you're a funny guy and a very free spirit, and I tend to be kind of a, technically dense person. What if we combined our talents and wrote this together and got the best of both worlds, a suspenseful but funny, lighthearted, suspenseful romp about, and he said, I'm in, I would love to do this. The question became then, how do you do it? I read some collaborative efforts, and I did not like them. I could see clearly that chapter 1 was this person and chapter 2 was that person. And it took the fun out of reading, because it felt disjointed. And Dave and I talked about this for hours. How do we make a novel seem seamless? How do we do this in a way where they don't go, well, that was a Ridley Pearson chapter and that's a Dave Barry chapter? And this idea of writing by character came up. And that one of us would take the dark, psychologically tense characters, and one would take the childlike, happy characters. And that we would share, instead of talking about it, we would simply hand our work over to the other person and trust that they wouldn't do this out of ego, they would do it out of necessity. If it wasn't working for them, they would change and make it, work for them. And that's what we've done now for over 10 years. And I have nothing but faith that Dave always makes changes in my work for the better of the work, not for the better of Dave Barry. And I think he has the same opinion. And what we've gotten are these books where we now don't remember. When we go and open a book, we don't remember who wrote the first time on it. If it's a pirate chapter, it's naturally supposed to be a Ridley chapter, but Dave does so much to the conversation in those chapters and makes them so funny that when I read them, I forget whether actually I wrote that first or he did. And I hope that as readers, when you read any of the Starcatchers books, we have a new one coming out called Bridge to Neverland, that you can't really tell who wrote it first. If we do our job well, you can't, because in fact we don't know. So I hope that answers.
It sounds more difficult than having China and America co-ruling the world, as someone suggests. Chimerica. Right?
Chimerica. Oh, I like that.
Another question?
Yes. The gentleman there, yes.
Mr. Pearson, I'm
Yes.
writing a novel right now, but I'm not quite sure if readers would like my ideas. So have you ever had this problem? And if not, what is the greatest challenge you've faced writing a novel?
Oh, I do have that problem, but I think you can't worry about your readers. I think you have to write the book that's important to you to write, and write it the way you feel it should go. You may find editors who then help you change some of that so that readers can find it easier to read or more accessible. But the minute you start writing to please a certain group of people, that's where Chip and I were talking about writing for kids. I can't write down to kids because then it's going to compromise the work. I just have to write it the way I want to read it. And that's what I encourage you to do, is write what's important to you, and I bet it will come out the best. Would you say so too, Chip? Because
Yes,
you do a
you've
lot of
got to
writing.
be faithful to your own true self first, right? Write something you're familiar with. Write something on people around you and the society or the environment in which you grow up. Well, start off something like that.
Yes.
Right? But tell me, there is a very strong in American novel called science fiction.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, yes.
Arthur Clarke, right?
Yes.
You know, that kind of people. I mean, they write simply out of nothing, right?
Yes.
Future.
Yes.
Right?
As did, I think, to a large extent, although it's not science fiction, one of the reasons I admire J.K. Rowling's effort with Harry Potter is she doesn't simply write about kids and magic.
No.
She creates a whole universe. Every little detail
every
is
detail.
new,
Color,
invented, a new
smell,
name, a new
exactly,
word. Oh
yes.
my gosh.
Right.
The degree to which she went to write these books.
Meticulous is the word.
And,
right?
and, you know, that alone makes them seminal works. They'll last forever, you know, other than the billions of copies she sold.
Well, so do you. I mean, taking a paragraph as an example. Maybeck stood inside a dark enclosure the size of a large closet. It had a concrete floor from which a low brick wall rose to waist level. From there, framed lumber intersected by long bamboo poles rose geometrically overhead, wrapped on the outside with heavy brown vinyl. Fake brick.
Yes.
It's such a meticulous differentiation of materials where you can almost feel the textures.
Yes, well, thank
of,
you. I
these
think it's
objects.
really important that when you write, that you touch all the senses.
Yeah.
We have all the senses, and you have to remind the person what it smells like in the room, what if it's not on every
visualize.
page.
And
but
visualize.
that's how we all become embedded in the environment in our novels. The most important thing in your story, though, is the character.
Help people to imagine, help people to think and see
Yes.
what you do, right?
Yes.
So together it added up on outside to what looked like an Asian temple, but inside it smelled bad, really bad, like one of those porta potties at the state fair. Now, what is porta potties?
They're these
I mean, they
little,
sound aliens to
it's
foreign.
a little
foreign.
fiberglass toilet.
Exactly, right.
Does not smell good inside.
Right. I mean, this is when names like T.S. Eliot, I mentioned to you yesterday, came across my mind. I mean, T.S. Eliot is very good in portraying smell. You know, you get lines, the morning comes to consciousness of a faint state smell of beers from the sawdust trampled street, right?
Yes.
Because, right?
I write about smell a lot. I actually get my editors cut that back because for some reason I'm always thinking of the world in terms of how it smells. I have a detective in a set of books I've written called Lou Bolt. And Lou Bolt has a very keen sense of smell. And my editor would say, you know, enough with the smell. I mean, every time we go in a room, Lou Bolt's telling us how it smells. I don't care how it smells, you know. So we cut those kind of things
So
back.
popular literature and what you call serious or academic literature, they go together. I mean, T.S. Eliot and Ridley
Yes, well,
Pearson.
he's very serious.
The
I'm more
winter
popular.
evening settles down with smell of sticks in passageways, 6 o'clock. You know, the butt-out ends of smoky days, right? You call that poetry, you know, but
I wish it were poetry.
Well, but
Are
this
you
could be
ending us?
quite poetic. No, not yet. Are we not finishing until, what, 3:30?
Actually, there will be a signing session.
Okay. So any more questions? Right? The lady in the dark green, right?
Yes.
Do you really write, as it says on your profile, suspense novels in the morning and younger stuff in the afternoon? How
Yes.
do you keep them both in your head at once? And what's your daily writing routine?
Yes, that's exactly my writing routine. I wake up quite early, and Marcel and I get the kids off to school, and I start in on my crime novels. I don't know why, but I always do the crime novels first. And I write for 4 hours, 4.5 to 5 hours on the crime novels and take a very short break for lunch, 15 or 20 minutes. And then I start in on the young adult books and work all afternoon on those. I have, the burden of luxury in that I don't want to say no when I'm offered these wonderful chances to write a series set in Disney World or to work with a great writer like Dave Barry. So rather than say no, I just take on too much work. And I'm determined to turn my work in on time. So I just end up having to write between 8 and 10 hours a day to get these 2 and 3 books a year I'm writing. I used to just write the 1 book a year, my crime novel. And I would write about 5 hours a day. But now, because I've taken on more work, I just have to write an awful lot more. But I just hate to say no. So it's a blessing, and I'm not about to complain about it. People ask me, how can I possibly do this? But if you think about an attorney, an attorney has 5 or 6 cases that he might be working on in any given day and writing about each of these. And I don't think it's so hard to turn these things on and off. And what I've found is I get actually more excited because I know my time is limited. I work hard in this time, and then I'm dying to get back to the crime novel or dying to get back to my young adult novel. I got up this morning, and I was just so eager to write. I'm very near the end of the next Kingdom Keepers, and I so badly want to finish it. Not to get it done for the deadline, but just because I'm so excited by the story. So I really find it's a blessing to work on multiple works, but it's draining, too. I mean, I've got big bags under my eyes,
Okay. Any more questions? Yes, the gentleman there.
I just wonder, you have 2 kids, right?
Yes.
Are they influenced by you in terms of writing at all?
I think they influenced me by my writing? I mean, I don't think either of them are thinking about being writers. They are both very good writers. I wish I could take credit for that. I don't think I can. I think it's more that Marcel and I got them reading very young. And any kids who read a lot, I think, are better writers, just by nature. I mean, the only way I can become a better writer is to read more. So I just read all the time, as many different kinds of writing as I can, because it's the only way. And I'm a gourmet reader in that I read a paragraph and I go, oh my gosh, and reread it again and reread it again and deconstruct it each time. How can that? But we all use the same words. That's what's so annoying about reading a very good writer, is I think I know all those words. I can put words in that same order, so why don't I? It gets very frustrating. I'm reading a crime writer right now called Brett Lott. And his writing is simply beautiful, as is the writer Dennis Lehane. It's just so accomplished. And it isn't that he's writing with $50 words. He's writing with the words we all use every day. But the order he chooses to put them in is mind-boggling. And I think, why can't I put them in that order? Please, let me put one sentence in that same order. But in fact, I just endeavor and never quite get there.
Another question? The gentleman at the back, please.
So you obviously draw a lot from the Disney movies for the Kingdom Keepers.
For the Kingdom Keepers, I draw from the Disney parks. Yes, not the movies, but the parks. Yeah.
I was just wondering what other influences you draw from.
Yeah,
for
that's
your
good.
Novels.
In my crime novels, I do a lot of interviewing of the police and of criminals. I read newspapers and I'm always looking for the article that no one else is going to see, the article that's on page 19. I'm accused by my wife and my good friend Dave Barry of always thinking of how to kill people. Today, as we were riding the trolley to lunch, I conceived of a great way for a ransom bag to be passed, because your trolleys pass so closely. I thought somebody could hang the ransom out the door, and as the next trolley came by, the arm could snatch it. The police would never catch the guy. So I'm just always looking and thinking about where another idea could come from. And in fact, I am always trying to kill people, so look out.
I know that you have a tentative title for the Kingdom Keepers Book 6, which is Shell Game. Do you have a title for Book 6 or 7?
I do not have a title for 6 or 7. And I keep getting tempted to change my mind on Shell Game. But it fits the story well, so I probably will keep it. But now, just in the last 2 weeks, in fact, you're probably the first person to hear this in public, you know, that I've decided to write 2 books set on the cruise line. I really just couldn't control myself, is what happened. And Disney really doesn't want a book that's bigger than maybe 85 or 100,000 words. And I had written 85,000 words, and we were 1 day into a 15-day cruise. And I wrote my editor and said, this is going to be a problem if I have to end this story in the next 5,000 words, because I still have 6 places to go to. And so we decided it would be okay if I continued book 6 on the cruise line. So I assume that book 5 still will be called The Shell Game, although I've run into some really nice titles. It's funny how titles are. You're writing along, and you kind of look back a few sentences and go, ooh, that would be a good title. And so I kind of collect these, and we'll see. But I imagine book 5 will certainly be called Shell Game. Thank you for knowing that. I appreciate that.
Is there a question at the back?
What's the best advice you would give to writing?
Yeah, I don't know that it's the best advice, but I do have a couple different pieces of advice I can give. The first is to read and read and read some more. You can't read enough. So, put away the Game Boys and put away the DVD and read. It's really the best advice I think any writer can have, is to read more, myself included. I wish I read more. In terms of how to get something written, there's a terrific writer called Ethan Kanan in the United States who works at the Iowa's Writers Group. And there's an amazing writer in Central America called Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And both of these writers write 1 page a day. They sit down in the morning and they write 1 page. It might take them 20 minutes. It might take them 5 hours. But they write 1 page. They start the day by looking at the page they wrote the day before. They make notes. They fix it a little bit. And then they write 1 page. At the end of a year, they've written 350 pages and they have a book. So what I advocate is disciplining yourself to write a certain amount of time. It might be a half hour. It might be 1 hour. It might be a half a page. It might be 1 page. But set a goal for yourself, and don't let anything, except maybe a fire, stop you from achieving that goal. Don't go golfing. Don't turn on the television. Don't go to the bathroom 15 times. If you're going to write for that hour, sit down and write for that hour. And if you do this day after day, you begin to produce a body of work. If you make up excuses why you shouldn't be there, you will just make up excuses your whole life and you'll never write anything. So really the best advice I can give, I think, is to put your bottom in a chair and do it. Whether it's for 30 minutes or an hour, or in my case, 8 or 10 hours a day. Devote yourself to that, and you will see, if you do this long enough, wow, I've written 40 pages, or I've written 400 pages. You begin to see your work take shape. You may not be an outliner. I'm an outliner. I insist on knowing the beginning, the middle, and the end. I write in something called mythic 3-act structure, which is what I teach at the college level. Harry Potter, T.S. Eliot, anybody who's written a very big, important book you can break down into these 3 pieces because it comes from the Greeks. It's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even a 5-act Shakespearean play, 5 acts, can be broken down into 3 acts. Macbeth is 5 acts, but the middle 3 acts are actually a single dramatic act. They're the middle of the piece. In the first act, we meet the people who are going to populate our work. We meet where it's going to take place, and we discover the conflict. Usually in the middle act, we learn more about these characters, and our conflict complicates. And in the third act, there is a resolution to the conflict. And most important, the character takes something away. Whether that's knowledge of self, knowledge about another person, a chalice, a diamond, an animal, there is some prize obtained. And the worst fiction, and the worst movies, you know how you come out of some movies and you go, you know, I liked it, but it just didn't. If you go back and look at that movie, the lead character didn't take something away. There has to be a win in the fiction. And when that's lost in fiction, the reader has this, they like the piece, but they have this unsettled feeling as they leave the piece and think, yeah, but it just wasn't that fulfilling. And that's because the character didn't have a fulfilling moment. So that was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Thank you, Mr. Shah.
Thank you.
And thank you all the questions. So if there are no more questions from the floor, this is the end of the seminar.